And a glorious good afternoon. I know half of y'all are at work, but this is when I have time. So I'm going to pick up chapter 9. And as I always start, please, 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 never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because in our history, it's the only thing that ever has. So be that person. Okay. Picking up chapter 9 of Black AF History. And again, I encourage you to get this book in your library. Also get Nixon's Piano, because that will open your eyes to be able to receive a lot of what's going on. All right. This chapter is entitled Something Else. In 1948, James Harriet, with cement blocks in his own two hands, built the homestead that would house every successive generation of his family. For most of his adult life, he worked a, quote, good job, end quote, at a local newspaper factory while running a two-car taxi company on the side. When his family grew to 6 kids, he added a bedroom and turned the cement patio in the rear into a space from which he operated his cab company. Even after he moved his taxi stand to another location a block away, my family would still refer to that part of the house as the back porch. Separating the back porch area from the rest of the house was a hollow core door made out of pressed wood. Since the 1950s, everyone who came to the house, that's strangers, family, and friends, signed that paper-thin shell of a door. When I eventually inherited the bedroom on the back porch as a teenager, some of my neighborhood friends would spot their grandparents' names scribbled in marker on both sides of the door. It documented teenage loves, high school football jerseys, and black vernacular from groovy to dope. At eye level, 3 square holes about the size of postage stamps pierced the wood of the back porch door. I always assumed the door had been damaged naturally until my late grandmother recounted the story of how those holes came to be. One time, a crew of white men came to the house, outraged because my grandfather had been picking up people in the white community who called him for a ride, which was a no-no in the late 1950s. The men somehow got on the back porch and started trashing things. My grandparents scuttled all 6 children into the bathtub, and my grandmother grabbed her pistol. When the first of the 3 bullets pierced the back door, the intruder screamed, "Buck, you lucky." Then an eerie silence fell. Huddled in the tub, the entire family did not make a sound, other than my grandfather praying. My grandmother said they stared at the back door for for hours, not knowing what they'd find when they went out. Was his business trashed? Would there be a dead white man lying on the ground? My grandfather eventually opened the door, and no one was there. The mob had destroyed the cab stand, but he eventually recovered from that loss. No one ever came back to harass them, and no one ever claimed responsibility. I've always thought that we should remove the door and preserve it as a piece of our family history, but it still swings on the same hinges. Hinges, unvarnished. The names and the notes on it are still faded. Even when I argued that the door was too thin to offer any real protection, my grandmother would contemplate my argument before pointing to that single incident from years ago. In her eyes, that splintering slab of pressboard saved the Harriet family. They would never replace it. They didn't take anything, I once pondered. Do you think that they were just trying to scare y'all, or do you think they wanted something else? She answered without hesitation, something else. On November 4, 1890, the white citizens of South Carolina celebrated the election of serial killer turned governor Benjamin Pitchfork Ben Tillman. White South Carolinians were well aware of Tillman's penchant for mass murder, beginning with his time as a recruiter for the Sweetwater Sabre Club, a clandestine a clandestine paramilitary fraternity devoted to killing as many black people as it could. Tillman had already been indicted for murdering at least 6 black men in Aiken County, South Carolina, after the leading white men of Edgefield decided to provoke a riot and teach the Negroes a lesson by having the whites demonstrate their superiority by killing as many of them as was justifiable. The future governor gained even more fame when his club members assassinated black state representative Simon Coker as he knelt in prayer. The triumph of democracy and white supremacy over mongralism and anarchy, of civilization over barbarism, has been most complete, said this king of the lynchmen to his inauguration crowd. The whites have absolute control over the state government, and we intend at any and all hazards to retain it. The intelligent exercise of the right of suffrage is as yet beyond the capacity of the vast majority of colored men. We deny, without regard to color, that all men are created equal. It is not true now, and it was not true when Jefferson wrote it. Following his amateur career as a serial killer and his term as governor, Tillman represented South Carolina in the United States Senate until he died in 1918. Tillman was just one of many ethnic cleansers elected after Reconstruction. Georgia Governor turned U.S. Senator John Brown Gordon, one of the engineers of the Compromise of 1877, was also commonly recognized as the head of Georgia's Ku Klux Klan. Alabama's Klan leader, John Tyler Morgan, served in the Senate for 3 decades, from 1877 until 1907. Morgan fought to repeal the 15th Amendment and introduced bills to legalize the practice of racist vigilante murder, i.e. lynching, as a means of preserving white power in the Deep South. Morgan served in the Senate alongside another Alabama Klan leader, Edmund Pettus, who represented the state for a decade until his death in 1907. Tennessee Congressman George Gordon doubled as his state's grand dragon and had written the precept for the Ku Klux Klan. Mississippi's great white chief, Governor James K. Vardaman, was unapologetic about his pro-lynching stance when he said, "There is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter." Mississippi's Constitutional Convention of 1890 was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the nigger from politics. Not the ignorant and vicious, as some of the apologists would have you believe, but the nigger. Let the world know it just as it is. In Mississippi, we have in our Constitution legislated against the racial peculiarities of the Negro. When that device fails, we will resort to something else. Wow. There is always something else. After emancipation, the something else was the racial terrorism of Reconstruction. The Jim Crow era was the something else that followed citizenship, voting rights, and due process. The Klan was something else. If American exceptionalism exists, perhaps it lies in the country's remarkable ability to conjure up something else to satiate its appetite for black bodies. Du Bois believed the violent epidemic could be cured with an appeal to white men's sense of justice and fairness. He was determined to curb the mob murder fad that was overtaking America. On April 24, 1899, he left his home in his finest attire, his walking cane in one hand, and a letter of introduction to the editor of Georgia's most prominent media outlet, the Atlanta Constitution, in the other. In truth, Du Bois needed no introduction. His reputation as the Harvard-educated scholar preceded him. He had taken the job at Atlanta University after finishing the first sociological case study of the black community in the United States, entitled The Philadelphia Negro, and was now engaged in groundbreaking research on the state of blacks in the South, including the lynching problem. It occurred to me, Du Bois wrote, that I might go down to the Atlanta Constitution and talk with Joel Chandler Harris and try to put before the South what happened in cases of this sort and try to see if I could start some sort of movement. Armed only with his superior intellect, the great and honorable W.E.B. Du Bois was about to figure out what the hell was wrong with white people. Instead of taking a segregated streetcar, Du Bois chose to walk to Chandler's Atlanta office. During his stroll, he discovered that a local retailer was offering a very distinct item for sale: the knuckles of Sam Hose, a recent victim of lynching. Du Bois stopped in his tracks, reversed course, and went back home. I did not meet Joel Chandler Harris, nor the editor of the Constitution, he wrote, explaining that his work was forever disrupted when he realized that one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. For 2 weeks, the story of Sam Hose had captivated the country. By all accounts, a brilliant, self-educated man, Hose had given up dreams of higher education to take care of his mother and intellectually disabled brother. While Hose was working as a field hand on April 12, 1899, his employer, Alfred Cranford, pointed a gun at him after he requested time off to visit his sick mother. To defend himself, Hose threw an axe at Cranford, and that then killed him. When police arrived to investigate, Hose had already fled the scene. He knew he had no shot at justice. Something else was coming. Over the next few days, police did not investigate the crime scene, collect evidence, or interview witnesses. Instead, Georgia's governor, the Atlanta Constitution, Coweta County authorities, and private citizens offered cash rewards for Hose's capture. Newspapers printed outlandish rumors, further instigating ire. Some reported that Hose had killed his boss after he was caught raping Cranford's wife in front of the couple's newborn child. They claimed Hose was insane from syphilis and continued his unfinished sexual assault after he hacked Cranford to pieces. A subsequent investigation by local officials found that Cranford's wife and child were unharmed. When Hose was captured on April 23rd, a lynch mob of at least 500 white people kidnapped him from the deputies and took him to a field. People from across the state boarded trains to view the spectacle, but they did not lynch Hose immediately. First, the crowd took turns cutting off pieces of Hose's nose, ears, fingers, and genitals. Others used their knives to stab him repeatedly as onlookers cheered. Then they skinned him alive and doused him with kerosene while young children collected wood to build a pyre before burning him alive, watching as his veins ruptured and his eyes withered. After the fire subsided, the crowd diced Hose's dead body into pieces and sold the remnants of their handiwork as souvenirs for those not fortunate enough to have attended the, quote, barbecue, end quote. The festivities concluded with a prayer and a sign marking the occasion reading, quote, "We must protect our Southern women," end quote. Between 1889 and 1922, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, counted 3,436 lynchings, a rate of 2 black people each week. Although this bloodlust was often characterized by mob violence, accusations of crimes, or hangings, white people would continue to implement increasingly brutal new techniques in the great American pastime of murdering black people in bulk. Their techniques varied so widely that the NAACP eventually came up with 4 distinct qualities that defined lynching. The first was someone had to die for an incident to qualify as a lynching. I know that seems obvious, but when around 25 masked men dragged Joe Reed out of his Nashville jail cell, put a rope around his neck, threw him over a suspension bridge, and shot at his body until the rope broke, he technically wasn't a lynching victim because he survived. Number 2, NAACP, 3 or more people had to take part in the killing. The makeshift rules didn't stipulate large crowds, like the one that appeared at 16-year-old Fred Rochelle's lynching. When a deputy handed the teenager to vigilantes in Bartow, Florida in 1901, the mob kindly arranged for a special train to transport onlookers to the, quote, barbecue, end quote, before forcing Rochelle into a barrel, chaining him to a stake, dousing him with kerosene, and burning him alive. The third technique that qualifies for a lynching, according to the NAACP. All lynchings are illegal. For instance, after a crowd of more than 100 pursued Fred Sullivan and his wife Jane after their arrest, the couple confessed to burning down a barn in the Hollia, Mississippi. But it hadn't been legal for deputies to turn the pair over to a committee of citizens, especially since the deputy came back to discover 20 men had organized a judge-lynched court and carried out the execution with little formality. The next, or the last one, excuse me, number 4. Whether the murder was for justice or tradition, there had to be a reason for the lynching. David Walker was killed because he spoke disrespectfully to a white woman, a no-no in 1908 in Kentucky. The mob riddled Walker's wife Annie, an infant child, with bullets as they fled their burning house. The men shot 3 more of Walker's children before they would tell. The oldest son stayed in the house, so the night riders set it on fire just in case. You see, there's always a reason. The lynchings of Thomas Moss, Will Stewart, and Calvin McDowell in Memphis, Tennessee in 1892 were a prime example of how Black Death came resultant from this white hero. Moss, a postal worker, was part owner of People's Grocery in the Curve neighborhood of South Memphis. Before Moss, Stewart and McDowell joined. Before Moore, Stewart, and McDowell joined 8 other prominent black men to open the store, William Barrett's grocery store had Memphis grocery game on lock. Barrett hated People's Grocery for infringing on his territory, even though Barrett's store had a reputation for gambling and selling bootleg liquor. When People's opened across the street from Barrett's, even white customers patronized the black-owned business. On March 2nd, 1892, a young black kid was outside Peoples playing marbles with a white boy. The two got into a fight over the game, and when the black kid started winning, the white boy's father jumped in. Stewart and a few bystanders stopped the white man from thrashing the black kid, and a crowd gathered around. The next day, the father had let the incident go, but Barrett brought a Shelby County Sheriff's deputy to Peoples to look for Stewart. When Barrett discovered Stewart wasn't working, he started ranting about how black people were violent thieves. And to prove his point, he hit McDowell with a pistol. Apparently, white people in Memphis were really bad at fighting because McDowell was able to recover, snatch Barrett's gun, and fired at him. McDowell missed, but you know the white men don't take their butt whippings like men. They issued warrants for McDowell, Stewart, and even the little boy from the first fight. The entire black community was outraged and, during a neighborhood meeting, vowed to clean out the white trash. 2 days later, all of white Memphis had heard about the black conspiracy. On March 5th, a law enforcement officer used the powers granted to him by whiteness to deputize 5 armed white civilians and cover the front and back of the People's grocery store. But Peoples had already assembled a few black men who were anticipating mob violence. They mopped the floor with Barrett's boys. The white deputies then retreated back to Barrett and sent actual deputies to arrest the black crew. When the men at the People's store saw the uniforms, they readily surrendered their weapons and explained that they thought Barrett had brought some jack-legged white thugs to the store to kill them. Even though Moss was in the back tending to the books, he was still arrested because, as a postal worker, he was said to be the leader of the anti-white conspiracy. On March 9, 75 masked white men stormed the jailhouse, dragged Moss, Stewart, and McDowell out of their cells, and took them to a railroad yard outside of town. McDowell, who had whipped 2 white men, was shot 4 times in the face, leaving holes as big as fists. Stewart was shot in the neck and the eye. Moss, the owner, who had nothing to do with the alleged crimes, was shot in the neck. After the executions, a criminal court judge issued an order instructing the sheriff to, quote, take 100 men, go out to the curb at once, and shoot down on sight any Negro who appears to be making trouble, end quote. Armed white posses emptied local hardware stores of their guns and ammunition and heeded the judge's order. Evidence would later emerge that the judge may have even participated in the lynching. As the black residents of the curve hid in their homes, white residents looted People's grocery, forever eliminating Barrett's black-owned competitor. Following the lynching, one specific quote began to filter through Memphis's black neighborhoods. As he lay dying, Moss supposedly uttered his last words, quote, tell my people to go west. There is no justice for them here, end quote. There was only one woman for the job of spreading that message. Although she was a transplant, she considered Moss and his wife to be the best friends she had in town, and served to be the godmother to their oldest daughter. The brutal murders thrust her into the national spotlight, transforming a relatively well-known, outspoken journalist into one of the most fearless investigators and crusaders for justice in history. That woman was Ida B. Wells. Excuse me. The city of Memphis had demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against a white man or his rival, because because his rival, wrote Wells in the week's edition of the Memphis Free Speech. There is therefore only one thing left that we can do: save our money and leave a town which will never protect our lives and our property, nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but takes us out and murders us in cold blood when accused by white persons. And just like that, Memphis nearly ran out of black people. Wells was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi. After both her parents died from yellow fever, she assumed responsibility for her siblings at age 16. Despite these circumstances, she managed to achieve a formal education at Rusk College and Fisk University, eventually landing a job as a school teacher in Memphis. In 1884, Wells sued the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway for dragging her off the train after she refused to give up her first-class seat to a white man. She won the lawsuit, but the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed it. When she was asked to write about her experiences in the local newspapers, outlets across the country noticed her talent. Her unapologetic willingness to take on Jim Crow made her a national favorite, earning her a one-third stake in the Free Speech and elevating it to one of the most radical and talked about newspapers in the entire country. A few weeks after the murders, the superintendent and the treasurer of the City Railway Company visited Wells at the newspaper office. Hearing about her influence in the black community, they begged her to help them get black patrons to ride the city streetcars. And for some reason they couldn't explain, their most loyal customer base had suddenly disappeared. When Wells asked the men to posit a reason for the recent loss of black customers, the men replied that they had been told that black people were afraid of electricity and assured her that the electricity was safe and reliable. Amused by the level of their caucasity, Ida B. Wells informed the businessmen that black people had not suddenly become afraid of electricity in the last 6 weeks. Quote, why, it was just 6 weeks ago that the lynchings took place, end quote, she explained. We have learned that every white man of any standing in town knew of the plan and consented to the lynching of our boys. The colored people feel that every white man in Memphis who consented to Thomas Moss's death is as guilty as those who fired the guns which took his life, and they want to get away from this town. We told them the week after the lynchings to save their nickels and dimes so that they could do so. A few days later, Wells published the entire conversation. By then, black people were leaving Memphis in droves, heading out to Oklahoma. Hundreds of others were boycotting white-owned businesses, and Wells was just getting started. On May 21, 1892, in an editorial published in the Free Speech about a recent case of a black man who had been falsely accused of raping a white woman, Wells called out, quote, that old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern men are not careful, a conclusion might be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women, end quote. In response, every white-owned newspaper in the city ran veiled threats to Ida B. Wells. The Evening Scimitar wrote, quote, if the Negroes themselves do not apply the remedy without delay, it will be the duty of those whom he has attacked to tie the wretch who utters these calumnies to a stake at the intersection of Main and Madison Streets. Brand him in the forehead with a hot iron and perform upon him a surgical operation with a pair of tailor shears. End quote. That's veiled, right? It would be the Memphis Free Speech's final bow. A white mob destroyed the printing press and ran Wells's co-owner out of the city. Wells was out of town visiting friends in New York, but locals warned her that men were stationed outside of her house and at the train station watching for her arrival. She would never return to Memphis. If Ida B. Wells had one gift, it was that she was born with what scientists have now identified as the genetic marker IDGAF. Wells's uncompromising stance, combined with her inability to accept even the slightest hint of racism and discrimination, is what made her one of the fiercest truth tellers in the history of America. With her relentless reporting and unwavering advocacy, she became the undisputed leader of the anti-lynching movement. She didn't just call out white violence either. Wells also fought for women's suffrage, children's rights, and labor reform. She called her peace and armed self-defense. She called for peace and armed self-defense. She was Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and Oprah and Beyonce. Using a combination of statistical data, investigative techniques, and fearless truth-telling, she revolutionized journalism, and during her time, she was arguably the most famous black woman in America. Period. One of Wells's most frequent targets was her celebrity counterpart, the most famous and well-regarded black man in the country, Booker T. Washington. She publicly called out Washington's "just be quiet and maybe they won't kill us." That was Booker T. Washington's stance that favored fighting white supremacy by actually allowing white people to be supreme. Ida said, "We're not having that." In her criticism of Washington, Wells was always sure to point out that the oppression of the Negro was not a Southern phenomenon, nor could it be cured by an industrial education of black obedience. They hail with acclaim the man who has made popular the unspoken thought of that part of the North which believes in the inherent inferiority of the Negro, and the always outspoken Southern view to the same effect, she wrote to Booker T. Washington. This gospel of work is no new one for the Negro. It is the South's old slavery practice in a new dress. It was the only education the South gave the Negro for 2.5 centuries, and she had absolute control over his body and his soul. However, Wells wasn't as bothered by Washington's prescription for the lynching problem as much as she was with his characterization of black men in general. As the foremost, and perhaps the only, lynching expert in America at that time, Ida B. Wells often reminded her readers that the dismissive demonization of black people as racists and criminals is what leads to mob violence. Wells knew that lynching had nothing to do with crime or justice. It was caused by something else. Mr. Washington says, in substance, give me money to educate the Negro, and when he is taught how to work, he will not commit the crime for which lynching is done. Mr. Washington knows when he says that lynching is not invoked to punish crime, but to punish color. And not even industrial education will change that, Ida B. Wells wrote. Washington wasn't the sole recipient of Wells's draggings. While she appreciated her white supporters, she issued not-so-gentle reminders to forward-thinking white women that they should watch their racist mouths, much to the delight of her black fans. As her notoriety grew, Ida B. Wells became Black America's go-to person for dispelling racist stereotypes. In fact, one of the most famous beats changed the way we viewed the lynching epidemic. During a tour of Great Britain, Frances Willard, a leading white suffragist and president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, advocated for the banning of alcohol by noting that the, quote, colored race multiplies like the locusts of Egypt, end quote, because of it, adding that the saloon was Black America's, quote, center of power, end quote. Even before white people pushed forth the medical theory that racism lived in skeletal tissue, Willard insisted that not only didn't she have a racist bone in her body, but, as she said, so far as I know, I have not an atom of race of prejudice. Still, Willard believed the race problem could be solved by black people returning to Africa and stopping the obviously stupid darkies from voting and drinking alcohol. It is not fair that they should vote, nor is it fair that a plantation Negro who can neither read nor write, whose ideas are bounded by the fence of his own field and the price of his own mule, should be entrusted with a ballot. The safety of women, of children, of the home is menaced in 1,000 localities at this moment, so that the men dare not go beyond the sight of their own roof tree. The notion that hypersexualized black men find white women irresistible is one of the longest running white ideations of white America, ranking right up there with Bob Dylan's singing ability. Okay, I'm gonna read this sentence again. I'm sorry, y'all. The notion that hypersexualized black men find white women irresistible is one of the longest running white ideations in white America, ranking right up there with Bob Dylan's singing ability and Friends, the TV show, being fun. Y'all know Wells wasn't tolerating this nonsense. In her 1892 pamphlet, Southern Horrors, the lynch law in all its faces, Ida B. Wells dispelled the myth that lynchings were caused by rabid Negro sexual predators, revealing that less than 1/3 of lynching victims had been accused of rapes. Just before she departed for a speaking tour of England in 1894, Wells asked English newspapers to reprint Willard's interview just so that she could destroy that white nonsense. I find wherever I go that we are deprived the expression of condemnation, such hangings and burnings deserve, because the world believes Negro men are the spoilers of the virtual white women, as she wrote in a column during her tour. Unfortunately for the Negro race and for themselves, Miss Frances Willard and Bishops Fitzgerald and Haygood have published utterances in confirmation of that slander. When Wells met Willard face to face in Britain, she asked her about it, noting after their conversation that Willard finally seemed to understand the error of her remarks. The next day, Wells was supposed to give a speech at the British Women's Temperance Association when the organization heard that Wells had asked Fraternity, a black-owned British magazine, to reprint Willard's racist remarks. They threatened to cancel the speech and make sure Wells wouldn't receive any more opportunities to speak during her trip if she didn't get the piece canceled. Wells made the speech and asked the BWTA to pass a resolution condemning lynching, which they did to quiet the controversy. A few days later, the issue of Fraternity proceeded with publishing Willard's entire interview. Willard was mad AF. A black woman criticizing her publicly? She wouldn't stand for it, period. At the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Union's 1894 National Convention, Willard used her presidential address to attack Ida B. Wells, who attended the conference but was not present for the address to white women. Instead of admitting that Wells's actual statistics proved Willard's ignorance, Willard said Wells's zeal for her race had clouded her perception of her friends. She defended her belief that black men are pro-rape, while informing the audience that white men raping black women had largely ceased once slavery ended, explaining to her white friends who knew white people in the South because they told her as much. I make this statement on the testimony of well-informed Northerners who have long lived in the South and who are, like myself, of New England ancestry and training. With all those words, with all that those words imply, Willard explained to the white women in the audience. Let me read that again too, because that didn't flow right in my head. Okay. I make this statement on the testimony of well-informed Northerners who have long lived in the South and who are, like myself, of New England ancestry and training, with all that those words imply, Willard explained to the white women in the audience. An average colored man, when sober, is loyal to the purity of white women. But when under the influence of intoxicating liquors, the tendency in all men is a loss of self-control, and the ignorant and vicious, whether white or black, are the most dangerous characters. Willard ended by warning Wells to banish her vocabulary, banish that from all such allusions to white women having consensual sex with black men. Wells, never the shrinking violet, responded to Willard's ignorance and threats with the ancient African aphorism. I can show you better than I can tell you. In 1895, Wells produced the 100-page pamphlet, The Red Record, which reframed the lynching epidemic as America's problem, not a Southern phenomenon. Brave woman, you have done your people and mine a service which can neither be weighed nor measured, wrote Frederick Douglass in the preface of the pamphlet. If the American conscience were only half alive, if the American church and clergy were only half Christianized, if American moral sensibility were not hardened by persistent infliction of outrage and crime against colored people, a scream of horror, of shame, and indignation would rise to heaven wherever your pamphlet shall be read. Within Wells used sociology, the relatively new academic approach pioneered in America by W.E.B. Du Bois, to dissect the nationwide, state-sanctioned crimes against humanity. The Red Record was straightforward and unrelentingly forthright, with the exception of one part. Among the tabulated statistics and historical analysis, Wells addressed her nemesis in an unflinching takedown entitled, quote, Miss Willard's Attitude, end quote. After recounting the years-long quarrel, Wells challenged Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union supporters to prove that Wells had made a single incorrect or untrue statement. Quote, I desire no quarrel with the WCTU, but my love for the truth is greater than my regard for an alleged friend who, through ignorance or design, misrepresents in the most harmful way the cause of a long-suffering race, Ida B. Wells explained. When the lives of men, women, and children are at stake, when the inhuman butchers of innocence attempt to justify their barbarism by fastening upon a whole race, the obloquy of the most infamous of crimes, it is little less than criminal to apologize for the butchers today and tomorrow to repudiate the apology by declaring it a figure of speech. End quote. Willard didn't have much of a response after that. She just continued being white and being ignorant. Booker T. Washington, Frances Willard, and white women weren't the only ones for whom Wells had reserved a cachet of that smoke. They caught it. Anybody could get it, including her friend and colleague, the world-renowned scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. When leaders from around the country converged in New York in 1909 to discuss a different approach to solving America's race issue, Wells accepted the invitation to attend. Du Bois, who had just returned from studying in Germany, was the only black person chosen for a subcommittee to select representatives to lead a new national organization. Wells, the most recognized anti-lynching advocate in America, was sure her name would be on it. Yet when Du Bois announced the list of 40 representatives, Wells was not selected. Seething at what she called the deliberate intention of Dr. Du Bois to ignore me and my work, she marched out of the meeting as others begged her to stay. I want to tell you that when that list of names left our hands and was given to Dr. Du Bois to read, your name led all the rest, explained John Mulholland, who had also been on the selection team. It is unthinkable that you, who have fought the battle against lynching for nearly 20 years single-handed and alone, when the rest of us were following our own selfish pursuits, should be left off such a committee. It's offensive. A few minutes later, Du Bois confessed that he had removed Wells from the list and replaced her with one of his friends who wasn't even at the meeting because he thought Wells's efforts would be better represented by Celia Parker Woolley, a white woman. Realizing he had made a mistake, Du Bois amended the list of committee members to include Wells's name. She attended the group's next meeting with all expenses paid by the organization. At that conference, the group decided to put Du Bois in charge of publicity and research. His reputation as a well-known scholar and race advocate could help the group place articles and editorials into some of the country's most prestigious magazines and newspapers. Wells, however, argued that the group shouldn't have to submit to the whims and disposition of whites to have their voices heard. The executive committee agreed and immediately decided to launch their own magazine, The Crisis, under the organization's new name, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Being named as, quote, official Negro leader, end quote, did not cure Wells's allergy to patriarchy and white nonsense. She criticized the other members of the NAACP for electing Mary White Ovington, a white woman, as chairman of the executive committee. Wells had previously taught Ovington a few investigative reporting techniques, which eventually led to Ovington's success in pushing through housing reform in New York City. But Wells noted the air of triumph and the pleased look on her face after Ovington participated in the deliberations that temporarily erased Wells from the list of the NAACP founders. She has basked in the sunlight of the adoration of the few college-bred Negroes who have surrounded her, but has made little effort to show the soul of the black woman, Wells wrote. She has fallen far short of helping a race which has suffered as no white woman has ever been called upon to suffer or to understand. To paint Ida B. Wells Barnett with the oft-repeated trope of being, quote, angry, end quote, is too simplistic. Perhaps Wells dodged incorruptibility and that she openly criticized white benefactors and the fact that she was a black woman. partially explain how she is not generally included as a titan of black liberation on the same level as her more famous contemporaries. Booker T. Washington's approach is thought to be a relic of the past, but his legacy lives on. W.E.B. Du Bois is generally considered one of the fathers of black history and sociology, partly because his approach was not as contentious as Wells. But as Du Bois hypothesized that America's social, political, and economic structure enabled white supremacy, Wells contended over and over again that the problem was white people. While Southern Horace and the Red Record would define how the NAACP and various other agencies approached racial terrorism for a century, Ida B. Wells is scarcely mentioned in the NAACP's early literature. Much of her newspaper reporting has been lost to time. There is not a single copy of the Memphis Free Speech in existence. Still, Ida B. Wells remains the standard to which every black journalist in America aspires, and that's myself included. In 1969, before I was born, my grandfather was killed in a traffic accident by a drunk driver as he drove his last customer home. The white teenagers were never prosecuted. All I know about him comes from other people's stories. I have seen pictures, so I know he smoked cigars. He served in World War II and often wore a white shirt. I cannot tell how tall he was or how his voice sounded, but he remains a mythic figure in my life. I knew my grandmother well. She passed down my family's history and protected her family's legacy. She could make ice cream from scratch and patiently put up with my constant haranguing for more stories. She worked the same, quote, good job, end quote, at the same factory as my grandfather, yet she was not larger than life to most people. One time, while waiting for biscuits to come out of the oven, I asked her if she was afraid on that night that the men could just kick that fragile door off its hinges. Excuse me. She insisted. Oh, goodness. She insisted that she was not scared because my grandfather had assured her that his prayers were more powerful than all the men on all the porches in all the world. You weren't praying, Grandma, I asked. She pinched her apron with her right hand, used it to pull the pan of biscuits out of the oven, and just shook her head from side to side. No, Mikey, she said. She did not answer proudly, as if she wore her response as a badge of courage. She did it very matter-of-factly, like doors and black women sometimes will. I didn't want to close my eyes, she said, not with that pistol in my hand. That she was something else. Okay, I'm going to pick up the supplement tomorrow. So this is part 1 of chapter 8, and I'll pick up part 2 of chapter 8 tomorrow. It's 821, Black History. Learn it, teach it to the children, and share it with your peers. We got to get smart.